Make that big boss less special. It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level. Second level. Second level gaming. Second level.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for sticking out all of Pixelpop Festival 2018. This is the final panel of the show. And I'm really excited because this is our second year of having kind of rebranded the show and made it way more creator focused than it was originally. And when we rebranded the show, we started framing it as that it's a celebration of unique games and the people who make them possible, because that's what we really, truly, as indie designers, as lovers of games and progressive entertainment, we really do want to celebrate the fact that people are making something different. And so last year we had our first ever Celebrating Unique Games panel, and we got to just bring up a whole bunch of voices with a whole bunch of experiences, and I loved it. And as the director of the show, I get to keep the things that I love in the show. So this year we are doing the panel again with another group of amazing game creators. So I would like to invite them onto the stage. And I will introduce them all. We can go ahead and get started, if that's all right. So Kevin, Amanda, and Josh will be joining us today. And I guess I didn't really introduce myself. Hi, I'm Carol Mertz. I'm the executive director of Pixelpop, and I am so, so grateful for all of your support and for all of your presence here today. It means a lot. So, normally people do like a nice little intro to the panel after we're all sitting down and everything. I kind of just did that because I introduced the panel while I was standing up. So, I invited everybody to this panel because I think you all have really fascinating projects, you have fascinating experiences. Josh, you work on IntelliGame, where you kind of study and analyze games from a much more intelligent perspective, looking at games and what their possibilities are beyond what we normally see. Kevin, you are an incredibly experienced writer and have worked on so many interesting game projects that every time I hear about you in the game space, I'm fascinated by the amount of work that you're doing. And Amanda, you do these incredible alternative controller experimental projects that, again, like I think I first saw your work at on Train Jam this year, where you brought a phenomenal, you basically brought essentially Sententable, how do you pronounce? Sententable on the train. So that's kind of some, as you can imagine, some interesting projects up here. But if you all want to kind of introduce yourselves from your own perspectives and talk a little bit about what your experience and what your role in the industry is and why are you here? And I will just let you know that these silver mics are very sensitive, or not very sensitive, so you need to speak closely to them. But Amanda, if you would just want to angle yours, you should be good. Josh, you want to get started?
Oh, well, again, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for putting on Pixelpop. It is, it's one of my favorite shows for a reason. I am a critic, a game curator. I feel like my role in the game space is to find and highlight games that give us opportunities to think more deeply about ourselves and the world around us, and also to help curate and raise up other voices for folks who haven't had an opportunity to be heard in the past and may just be looking for some of that additional guidance or encouragement in finding their own way in the game space. And it's part of why I feel like Pixelpop is so important, because it's not like going to E3 or PAX where they're looking for you to have this big established sort of splash, and you also have to maybe adhere to a certain amount of this is what the industry wants. Pixelpop is a really great place to try and get started, to do initial networking, to bring something that's really polished or bring something that's relatively new and could use some information and guidance. My first time speaking at a convention professionally was Pixelpop, so I'm just really thankful for this space.
Thank you. I honestly didn't pay you to say that, and I didn't mean for this to turn into like a Pixelpop love session, but I appreciate that so much.
It's the last session of Pixelpop. I feel like it's part of it. It's just like, but this is also why I'm here. So.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Kevin Snow, and this is actually my first time at Pixelpop, and it's absolutely lovely. I prefer. I'm not going to say this eloquently, but I prefer these spaces where you can really have one-on-one conversations with the people that are making games and are playing the games that you've made, as opposed to, again, not to put down any other conventions, but when they're a lot busier and you can't really hear other people, it's really difficult to have these kinds of conversations that are really important to building the scene. And to kind of introduce myself, I guess, I'm a writer for video games freelance, so I work on studio and indie games, and I also direct my own projects and write and code and project manage all of those as well.
I'm Amanda Hudgins, and I do a lot of things, but I guess mainly why I'm here is alternative controls. Specifically, the one I'm probably best known for is Sententable, or the 1,000 Button Project. It's the thing with a bunch of buttons that you play a fighting game on. But I also am a writer in the industry. I work for marketing for my indie studio, Supersoul, which is based out of Kentucky. And what else? There's something else. Oh yeah, I run events. I run a lot of events. I run a lot of events.
What's that like?
It's a thing. We run a 2-month art show that's ongoing right now. We run a small Pixelpop-sized convention with no expo hall called Vector that's in the spring every year, and we usually run a consumer-facing convention called Let's Play in the fall.
Awesome. So, I love hearing all of your experiences. I'm curious what draws you? And everybody always starts out by saying I started playing games when I was a kid. I love video games, and that's awesome. But a lot of us started out playing games as a kid. What was it that really pulled you into games as a creative medium? I think we're all kind of doing something a little bit a little bit fringe. We're not making Mario. We're creating events, or we're writing thoughtful papers, or we're making really interesting intellectual games that make people think about their realities. So what is it that kind of pulled you into that?
Oh man, am I starting?
You can go ahead and get started. I just feel free to casual conversation, throw in whatever you feel.
Yeah. I don't know. I didn't really. I took a break from video games. So people are always like, "Oh, I started playing video games young." I can talk closer. That's fun. Hi. A lot of people say they started playing games young. I did, but then I quit because games clearly weren't for me. I think my sister said it best. We used to play Gauntlet Legends Dark Legacy with my family. It was the only game we played. And she said she realized that games weren't for her when she saw the Valkyrie, and Valkyrie has huge boobs and is running around with a sword.
Coming back to our representation talk that we had yesterday.
Yeah, and she was like, "Oh, games aren't for me." And I had a similar sort of feeling, and then I came back to games through mostly indie titles, and then I bullied the guy who runs the local organization into having me as an intern.
It's the best reason to bully.
I just showed up with I've gotten multiple jobs that way. I just show up and I'm like, "Hey, you should hire me," and then they're stuck with me for oh god, years. But I think what I liked about games as a medium specifically, because I've worked in a lot of other creative mediums. I've written, I've done photography and film. What I liked about games was that you can evoke an emotion through interactivity and play, which isn't necessary. Almost every artistic medium is empathetic to a certain extent, but you can't really. You're not asking someone to engage with you in the same level you are as with a game. I don't know if we've 100% hit that across the board, and I think in a lot of ways we haven't, but I think that potential is there, and that potential interests me.
I totally agree. I love that sentiment. Anybody else want to jump in on?
I absolutely agree with that. Probably the most exciting thing about video games to me is how it surfaces this kind of interaction between the creator and the audience that exists in other work, but it's much more direct in video games.
For me, I do think a lot of it was that experience of, oh, I played games as a kid, but for me, when I first played Final Fantasy, well, it was 2, but 4, when I played that game and saw the stories that were capable that games were capable of telling, and then I was like telling my friends, "Oh my gosh, this is so cool!" And they look at me like kind of strange. And then I did like a class report and used an emulator to show off this part, this scene, and everybody kind of looked at me like, "I'm not really sure what you're doing right now." I think that was the point where I realized like I see a lot of power in this medium, and I want to try and make that more accessible. I want people to understand, to see what I see in this space, and that is, I think, a big inspiration too.
Yeah, so you mentioned it's Final Fantasy that inspired you. Were there other games that inspired, like particular kind of turning point moments, or even games that are out right now that you're looking at and you just think, wow, like that's the next step, or like that's what really makes it feel like a special place, that feels like there might be this possibility for really harnessing emotion through gameplay?
For me, one of the games that's been a really big influence lately is Florence. It's a small, probably like 45-minute mobile game that you can pick up on iOS or Android. It's by Annapurna Interactive, and it's a linear story about a girl named Florence. She falls in love, and they're in a relationship, and then it doesn't work out, and like it's this story that is just so centered on providing this emotional experience and telling a specific story. And it's not about like, oh, well, let's make sure we can chalk in a bunch of extra gameplay and let's give it a bunch of alternate endings. There are a lot of things that we've done mechanically in the game space that have been really interesting, but I think sometimes distract from the human element. And I think that Florence does a really good job of boiling down to the core this mix of gameplay mechanics and also human storytelling. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I agree. I played that game. I was like, I've been wanting this for so long. It's just like, I want to read, but I want to play a game, and this is like that because I don't have to read, but I still get a beautiful story. So Amanda, you said you're here, you're kind of interested in, right now at least, in talking about a lot of the alternative controller work.
Yeah.
What was it that inspired you to start working on that? Like, what did you see in that space that brought you to working on the 1,000 Button project?
A couple of years ago, the studio I work for, Super Soul, we got into alt control with a project that one of my bosses at the time was working on. It involved racing Xbox 360 controllers across the stage, like back and forth. It was kind of silly, but we got into the show, and when I got there, I got to see a bunch of other pieces. I got to see Line Wobbler for the first time. I got to see the Choosatron, and a couple other pieces that I had never interacted with, which really got me into that sort of headspace. And then from there, it was just, okay, cool, what can I do with that? I built my first piece like the following summer, which was a really, really large, overly grandiose piece that was a bad idea and did it anyway. Involved a bunch of flagging tape, which is the stuff that you put around like trees in the woods when you're trying to mark where you are so you don't die. I bought a bunch of that, and I've like hundreds of yards of it hanging from a chicken wire fence on top of a bed, and then I put LED strips along it so that it could change color when you touched it. Don't do that. That took years of my life. Oh my God. It really only took about 6 months, but it felt like forever. And then I did that, and I was like, oh, so I can do interesting, cool things. The game that got me back into games was probably Crystal Warrior Kesha by Porpentine. That was the first game I remember playing and going, oh shit, games can be like that.
Yeah, this is like it's like a really wild twine game.
Yeah.
Where it just goes places you would never expect.
Yeah, when I was still doing more active video game writing, I made sure it was on the best of the year list every year. But it's that kind of sort of idea of like, okay, games can be this different, wild thing. And I mean, there's a bunch of games out now that I think are really intensely interesting, even outside of just like alternative control spaces. Like I think it's Thorny Games is a tabletop developer working on games like Dialect and Sign. and they're both really distinct and imaginative and put you into like a different perspective that you don't normally encounter in games.
How so?
Dialect is about creating a new language out of shared language between people, and you set up like an RPG sort of style situation, like you're trapped in the future in this weird place, and you're being persecuted, and so you have to create a secret language. And it's just really interesting to see people sort of build and create together these language things, and then they'll remember words later and they'll talk to each other in that secret language that they've created.
It kind of sounds like the kind of work that Avery Alder does with her RPGs, where it's very collaborative. She has, oh my gosh, why can't I think of the name of it right now? But there's a map creation game that she has that's just absolutely beautiful, where you just sit around and basically build a map together. And it's, some people are like, it doesn't really feel like a game, but it's like the best game I've ever played. And so I really love that perspective of like bringing people together. So Kevin, we've kind of brought up a little bit about like Twine and things. I know you work a lot in narrative. What are the experimental like things that you're seeing in narrative spaces? Like what draws you to that? Like, or what are things that you think are particularly inspiring right now in that space?
Right now, I've been playing Extreme Meat Punks Forever, which is
nice.
Pretty much essentially a hyper indie game, and kind of the elevator pitch for it that I've seen is like, it's a visual novel about 4 gay disasters who like get in these mechs made of meat and fight Nazis. And it's this like really exceptional game that kind of uses like violence in a way that's more interesting than a lot of similar games I play, where it's kind of using it as kind of a metaphor for like emotional messiness that the characters are undergoing in this like post-apocalyptic awful universe they inhabit, where like they pilot these mechs made out of like meat. It's really gross and weird.
And the audio is amazing, I heard.
Yeah, the audio is, yes. It's very good.
That's awesome. So, I mean, these are all games that these are games that probably most of the people in the crowd maybe haven't heard of, but they're groundbreaking. These are kind of taste-making games that really set the stage and create opportunities to inspire other people to make more games that are even more inspiring, and like they kind of feed this system of uniqueness. How are you seeing games kind of doing that, and how are you seeing these kind of experimental projects affecting the greater industry and maybe even other industries?
So I guess as far as I'm concerned, it's a little harder for me to speak to because I'm not a game creator, but noticing some of the trends in development and seeing particularly the ways like visual novels have been taking off lately, games like Dream Daddy or Monster Prom, or like all of these opportunities to give marginalized folks a easier access to creating games. And it's been really awesome. Even on the floor here, Burn Ban was a mobile, like it's on Google Play right now. And being able to read these stories and get these experiences from folks who didn't previously have an opportunity to have a voice in the game space is really fantastic. And I think that there will be more tools and more opportunities for folks to realize, like, hey, if you can make a game about your story, I can make a game about my story too. And those are some of the things I'm really excited about.
I think you hit on something really important when you mentioned influence, because earlier we were talking about Crystal Warrior, Kesha, and it was Porpentine's game Howling Dogs that got me to create my first games in Twine.
I think it's like there's like this great democratization of like tools, which I guess is only tangentially related to the question, but like this idea of like 10 years ago, I couldn't have made any of the stuff I'm making now. My boss could have. He has a background in electrical engineering, and he's been making games since he was 10 on, like the Commodore 64. I wouldn't have been able to. I didn't have access to those tools, and the sort of shared cyberspace just wasn't there. Like right now, Robin talked about it yesterday in his micro talk, but like if I have a question, there's an internet full of answers, and I can find those answers, and I think that's why you're seeing more creative endeavors from people who would be normally marginalized by any number of reasons.
Do you have any other shout outs for games by marginalized creators that you feel like are probably not as visible as they should be? I mean, so many games are not as visible as they should be, especially when they're by marginalized creators. And I think that this is a really great opportunity to talk about some of your favorites and kind of explain to us like why these games are important and why we should be playing them, why we should be paying attention.
Oh man.
It's a big question. But like, I mean, we see, you know, on the floor, we see, like even, you know, Noor is this,
Yeah.
by TJ. I don't know if he's here. He's probably showing his game in the hall, but he's one of my favorite examples.
He's live streaming his game.
He's live streaming his game. So I actually had the privilege of being able to work with TJ years ago because we found him. He's from St. Louis, and I used to have a studio here in St. Louis. And my business partners and I found him on Twitter, and we're just like, amazed that we'd never met this kid. He was like 18 or 17 at the time, and we were just like, this work is incredible.
Yeah.
We need to meet him, and we wound up working with him for a couple of years, and he wound up coming up with Noor while we were working together, and so we got to watch it grow, and seeing him create this amazing, beautiful, calm, like fun, funky, soothing game experience from the support of, you know, these tools that he'd been learning since he was 14, and the community that, you know, was supporting him and finally getting some visibility through the industry. Like, it was just so cool to see that level of growth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's people I know who make games that are really exceptional. Like there's Emma Kidwell who made, I'm totally spacing on the name right now, but it's basically about going condom shopping, and it's really fantastic, and it's a lot of fun, and that's Twine, and totally spacing on the name right now, but Michelle Earnhardt made a game at NYU Game Center about like dating, and it's kind of a visual novel about monsters, and that's also like that's fantastic work, and we're seeing more of that every day. And I'm really excited that it exists. And I think like curation services, like things like Warped Door and stuff like that exist and sort of perpetrate some smaller, lesser known indie stuff are really remarkable for kind of opening those doors.
I would say there are a couple things I can think of. One of them is going to seem a little close to the table, maybe where the water tastes like wine. I honestly respect Where the Water Tastes Like Wine as an opportunity to bring in a number of different marginalized creators and backgrounds, and I have a lot of respect for that project as a whole and what it does for storytelling. I also think, in a similar respect of like curating a bunch of marginalized voices together. If you don't know about Game Devs of Color Expo, that is a show that takes place in New York every year that specifically works on highlighting the works of people of color, and I think that even just the database that they end up coming up with at the end of the year of games to pay attention to, all from marginalized creators, ranging from sort of like deep introspective narrative games, all the way to just sort of like just casual like couch party games, tabletop, whatever. It's a really good opportunity to see folks who are out there working in the space, creating games from perspectives that you may not usually see.
It was a solid event. I got the privilege to go this past, it was 2 weeks ago actually, and it was just so cool to see all the different, it was only 2 weeks ago. It was so cool to see just the huge diversity of projects. It was so amazing. Kevin, do you have any that you want to shout out or?
One of my favorite designers working right now is a game developer named Grace, who one game of hers I can recommend is called Alien Casino, and it's this weird... Oh, I'm sorry, too far away. One of my favorite designers working right now is a designer named Grace, who made a weird game called Alien Casino that is free on itch.io, and it's like this weird like space you explore that's you're only in it for about 5 to 10 minutes, but like every aspect of it is like really weird and surprising, and then you're kind of just done with the entire experience. Oh, wow. But it's like lovingly crafted and just this kind of like fantastic short experience that you can have like a really good time with, and then you're just kind of done. And she makes a lot of similar games like that.
That's awesome. I really love that. So like, Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, like these are really amazing examples of really cool games that are inspiring, especially to marginalized communities that can see these games and realize that we have so many opportunities to tell our own stories. We have so many chances to make different kinds of experiences and experiment with the medium in ways that a lot of people haven't thought about. And I kind of want to get kind of your impressions on how you see this space changing in the future, how you see these games impacting the future of games. And we kind of touched on it a little bit, like opening up this space to create better representation and create more opportunities for growth. But what kinds of things would you even like to see? What kinds of projects would you like to be able to see in the space, and what kinds of an impact do you hope to see these games create in the long term?
Something I'm really excited about is the discussion that's happening right now that's changing the way that games are made. Like in studio culture, there's a lot of discussions around crunch and unionization, and that's kind of happening in the indie space as well, where we're talking about kind of like the collaboration talk right before this, where like what are the healthiest ways we can like work together as a team to make games, like what's equitable, what's equal, like all those conversations right now I feel are really changing the way that games are made, and that's kind of what I'm looking forward to the most, is how can we do this sustainably, how can we do this in a healthy way, how can we like be kind and good to each other while we make games.
Yeah, I loved that at this year's GDC, the big thing is this idea that we should unionize. We should come together. We should treat our employees well. We should take care of our teammates, and we should make sure that we're not destroying ourselves and destroying the industry. I mean, Amanda, your shirt I think says it all. I think that is, for those who can't see, it says this industry eats people, and I think it does, and I think that speaks volumes for how a lot of people who might make these unique games that kind of change the landscape as a whole may not feel as welcome. Like you said earlier, you didn't feel like games were for you.
No. I think that I'm more excited to see some more I know that I don't personally work in a AAA space, and I honestly probably won't. My skill sets have been kind of dispersed to such a level that I'm not super hireable for highly specialized jobs. But I think about that a lot. I think that it would be nice to see more projects being led by people who aren't white dudes. Just because it's such a I think that that's why we're stuck in this rut of AAA shooters. That can't be literally the only game anybody has ever dreamed of making. And I'm interested to see what a future holds where that isn't the case. And I'm also really fascinated by accessibility, and I think that one of the things that excites me about alternative controls is also a lot of these technologies being sort of siphoned off and used in stuff like accessibility controllers and stuff like that. And it's something I've talked with able gamers about, and I think it's really interesting, and I'm more excited to see that movement. You see the Microsoft accessibility controller coming out this year, which is really interesting, and I'd like to see more things in that direction, I suppose.
Awesome. Anybody else have thoughts on other things they'd like to see or add to that as far as seeing the future and the growth as inspired by people doing interesting things?
Yeah, I do think that very much, like you were saying earlier, this idea of taste making, right? That we're at this point where I think a lot of people are having discussions about whether or not spaces are becoming safer, whether spaces are becoming more inclusive. And I feel like even just over the past couple of years attending GDC and different, I can feel the shift in tone where I'm hoping that it means that more marginalized creators can come to the front lines. Seeing a show like Pixelpop, sorry, I'm not. Seeing a show like Pixelpop, where, you know, I talked to folks on the floor and interviewed them, and they said you can just look around and see that, like, they care about, inclusivity, that there are developers here from a bunch of different backgrounds. And I think that as more people are able to use various convention grounds as an opportunity to get their start, they'll naturally feed in not only to indie studios, but also into the AAA space. So my hope is that, like, we'll start to see some folks who are running these studios and can say, like, I mean, even if we look at Battlefield 5 and we can see the, you know, the massive outcry of anger from, you know, having women at the front of this Battlefield game, but that's still a really big step from like 3 or 5 years ago where this wouldn't have even been a thought. So my hope is that seeing more people make it through the space and realize, hey, this is a place where I can work and find folks to network with, will just kind of change the whole industry and tell more important, more interesting stories.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's obviously the hope of most event producers who are thinking about trying to make the industry a better space and a more inclusive and diverse space. And I appreciate hearing that you feel, you know, that we're doing, or at least taking the steps in the right direction. I know there's always room for improvement. We all have space to do better and to make everyone feel as powerful as the majority. And I think that, yeah, finding spaces where you can have your voice heard and finding opportunities to create work that matters to you and to play work that speaks to you and to experience those things. I mean, that's why can we just talk for a second about how magic itch.io has been for games like this? I mean, how many of you have used this and it's, you know, affected your production process?
Yeah, itch.io is amazing. Like I've been on it for years, and it's been really exciting to see it develop as like a community and a website, and to kind of, even from like a data standpoint, seeing like how many people are starting to be able to kind of carve out their own niche on the website, both commercially, sustainably, and so on.
Just having easy access to like the information that itch gives is just great. Like you can see, okay, these are the people, and they're coming from, well, I tweeted out a link, but nobody's clicking on that. They're all clicking on that one time somebody wrote about it on some blog I've never heard of. Mm-hmm. And just having like that level of information, which itch just supplies, is great. I ran my first game jam through itch, I think this year. And that was like just their tools in general, and the fact that it's accessible and available is just like amazing. Like we've done like Steam releases and stuff like that, and bigger releases to different platforms, and it's a minefield of like tech and barriers, and do I have a dev kit and all this stuff, and it's just really nice to have like an environment like itch where it's more straightforward.
Also, as a consumer, having the pay what you want model, so there can be a game that's 99 cents, but I'm like, wow, I'd rather pay $5 or $10, or sometimes people are like, no, just pay what you can afford. I think that really opens up accessibility in the space. And also being able to see a storefront that's rotating with a bunch of stuff that might not be whatever's the hottest selling right now. Being able to see pieces from developers who you've never heard of. Those are things that you don't see on more popular storefronts. So I really appreciate itch for that.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I consider myself a multidisciplinary designer, and I've done tabletop work, and I was able to use itch.io to distribute print and play, so people could buy the printable files and print them off, and that is something that it's magic. I mean, I was able to use that for Kickstarter. I was able to use it for just sending it to friends, or being able to promote it for a more affordable version than the actual print copy. So I feel like, yeah, like you mentioned, Amanda, these tools that are really democratizing the creation process and even the play process, giving us an opportunity to find work that we wouldn't otherwise, and to make work that we may not otherwise because we may not feel like we have a platform for it. I think that for me, to talk about what we'd like to see in the future, I want to see more things like that just open it up to more people and give people the opportunity to show their games and talk about their games and to play games by anybody.
If this exists, I would love to know, but I would like to see tools to allow you to really create games on mobile. It feels like having a lot of the development tools to be able to like work in Unity or different spaces like that give you a lot of accessibility, but you still are kind of barriered by, I need to have access to a computer, I need to have access to, whatnot. To see game creation tools exist on something that you could pull up on a Chromebook or on a cell phone, so that folks who don't have access to $500, $600, $700 laptops that they might use for development would still be able to tell their stories and create unique experiences. I would really love to see something like that.
I gotta say, pen and paper is a really good game design tool that is super accessible, and I love a whole lot. So that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to kind of bring up and talk about. Does anybody have anything else they want to share before we open up to questions from the audience?
I realized after we said I couldn't figure out what people's games I wanted to talk about, that I forgot about Humble Grove and their game. I think it's called 29. I played No Longer Home or Closer to Home or something. They're two queer non-binary devs out of like Japan, and they're currently kickstarting their newest game, and it looks incredible. And
you said the name of that was?
Humble Grove.
Humble Grove,
Yeah.
And it's on Kickstarter now?
Yeah, they're on Kickstarter now. They're fantastic. I've been following them for a couple years. But I was thinking about it, I was like, wait, I know somebody else. Who am I forgetting? And that's who I was forgetting.
It has about 3 weeks left, so please back it.
Support marginalized developers. Awesome, cool. So do we have any questions from the audience before we wrap up? No questions for us?
You've got one.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm sorry. I'm like looking at the crowd over here. I forgot there's a crowd over here. Hi, what do you have?
I have a question for the whole panel.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys go to other conventions to get I guess, some kind of creativity or
Inspiration?
inspiration, such as Mr. Kevin for your writing, all right? Star Trek or anime conventions, just to get a better grip or look at something a different way for your writing.
So the question is, do you go to other conventions, join other communities, and participate in other events outside of games in order to get inspiration for your work?
Cryptids.
Oh, yeah. Why'd you put me on the spot like that? So this is a little bit of a tangent, but someone in the audience brought it up.
Someone?
How dare they?
My game Southern Monsters is about cryptids, and I actually went to cryptid conventions while researching it, just to speak to people there. But to answer the question more generally, yeah, I think it's really important to go to, like, I'm very recently like a convention goer. Like my first game convention even was only in early 2017. But generally, I do think it's really important to look at other mediums and kind of bring in what's happening there into games, and to kind of like go outside of games a lot and look at like literature and theater, or even anything that's kind of like games adjacent, like comic books or something, or some kind of convention that has overlap. I think it's really important to bring that in. Yes. Very good shirt.
We've been a topic of conversation this weekend. I attend a lot of conventions. They're almost exclusively games conventions because that's all I have time for. But I started attending fighting game community tournaments, which are not quite game conventions in the traditional sense, because it's mostly sitting in the corner watching other people play Guilty Gear, which is a game I do not understand. But not necessarily events, but film. I watch a lot of movies, and I'm gonna say the number because I need you to understand that I don't just mean like I watch a movie every now and then. I saw 599 last year. I see an amount that's like obsessive. I'm lower this year. It's only about 200.
The year is not over yet.
The year's not over yet. So for me, it's a lot of background in sort of that thing, and I keep a strong tie to the game writing community that I used to be a bigger part of, and so I talk to a lot of people from there, and that's mostly sort of my like not when I'm working kind of thing, I guess. But I think that there's a dialogue between all of these different sort of communities, and I get a lot out of all of those interactions.
And also when you talk to people and like working in other fields, it's like really fun to compare and contrast. Like I have friends who like draw art for comic books, and it's like always interesting to like compare like sales and what conventions are like, and kind of like find the overlap between the different fields and kind of like commiserate really. And I don't know, it's fun.
Josh, how about you?
Yeah, I pretty much exclusively do game conventions, but I try to do a wide array of game conventions. So this year I attended Practice out in New York, Game Devs of Color Expo, Games for Change. I went to GDC, the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. I just try to look for opportunity, and TwitchCon is coming up because I do Twitch streaming. Just trying to find opportunities where it's not just like being on a general game floor, but also interacting with different communities and trying to find those different inspirations, like you were saying. And I also try to watch. I usually can tell when I'm low energy because I start watching cartoons. But I have found some really good, what I felt have really been really influential cartoons. Transformers Prime I went through a while ago, which was surprisingly dark. And then I've started watching Sonic Boom, which is this like amazingly self-aware meta show. So yeah, just places like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta say, I mean, or admit rather, that I'm really bad at this. Like that whole not being completely and utterly immersed in games. Like all of my friends are games friends, and all of my activities are all my conversations are games related, and all of my events are games related, and it gets a little tiring after a while. So then you sit down and you watch a trash cooking show, and you're like, yes, the worst cooks in America. And then you're like, oh wow, this is really interesting. What a unique way of storytelling and narrative design in these reality shows, or in Steven Universe, and all of these shows that are listening to a song and thinking, wow, how can I produce that sort of cadence in a game? And realizing that we can take inspiration from literally anywhere. And so often we just trap ourselves in our little, or at least I know I trap myself in my little game bubble, and forget that there's so much to be gotten from the rest of the world. Yeah, we have a question. So the question is about machinima, which is the art of basically taking in-game footage and cutting it into a film, and how do you see that merging somewhat with film and more as we would consider traditional narrative storytelling?
I mean, I don't know. Do you know?
So this is definitely not my expertise, but I did actually get started writing by making a webcomic based off the game Dwarf Fortress, which it wasn't like, there were like animated videos in it, so it kind of has some like overlap to machinima, but I haven't watched a lot of it in recent years. But I kind of it's on my radar sometimes, and I find it really interesting. But I don't have any particular well-formed thoughts about it, except that it seems like it might be kind of hard to do sustainably, since you run into copyright issues and things like that with making fan works. But anytime that comes onto my radar, I find it really interesting.
Yeah, kind of in a similar boat. My background, I have an interest in fan work and fan fiction in general, and sort of derivative fiction, but I don't have, and I have a really deep background in that, but I've never engaged with machinima in any variety.
I used to watch Red versus Blue, but that's about it. But I think that there's some interesting opportunities there, even to make games that are specifically designed for creating narrative stories like that, where it essentially functions as an engine. And in some ways, games like Gary's Mod and things like that are kind of that in their own form. So I think there are opportunities there. I think it's, as far as I'm aware, it's not really something that is a community that's at the forefront of games, and especially indie games, but I wouldn't be surprised to find that there's a really healthy community doing really interesting work, but I think all of us are not really the right the right folks to be able to speak on that specifically. But that's a really great question. Thank you so much. And that's pretty much the time that we've got. We can maybe take one more question. Yeah.
I think the question,
I'm going to reiterate the question really quick just so that folks who may not have heard that. So the question is, are video games art?
oh man. I think for me the question is does it matter? Because I don't know, like there's this whole concept of like what is art, and then I think it gets like bogged down by things like you can turn a toilet upside down and sign your name on it and it's art. But like I think if the idea is that if you construe it as art and then it's art, and so it's one of those like sort of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of things. And I get why the debate exists. It's just I've had it like rehashed so many times like internally. It's one of those things where it's just like, oh well, sure, but also maybe not, and I think that's okay. But
It's a conversation I used to have like a lot a couple of years ago, but I think probably my priorities started shifting and I started thinking less of, or maybe even worrying less about that specific discussion and worrying more about reaching people who aren't into video games for like accessibility reasons or because they've never played video games or they don't have gaming literacy. I think it's still like a relevant discussion, but I think I stopped worrying about it just because I don't know, like I think I stopped worrying about people's perceptions less, I guess, and started worrying more about how to like find other people who maybe aren't into games for reasons other than that.
kind of bridge that divide.
Yeah, I think particularly as somebody who tries to be like a curator in the space, that question comes up a lot. And I think the difficulty with it is that, I guess kind of like you spoke to, it's that idea of if we're answering whether or not, pardon me, if we're answering whether or not games are art, like to what end are we answering that question? And I think that particularly when it like had this big blow up in the news, or probably once every year, a couple of years, when somebody decides to write an article about it, the whole industry kind of gets bunched up about it for a bit. But I think now the question, like the medium has spread so much that we do find these other ways to engage our energy. And so instead of saying like our game's art, which seems like a lot of defining ourselves to outside forces and sort of justifying like, yeah, games should exist because they're good, whatever. It seems like there's a lot more energy put towards like, no, we just make games, and there are people who understand their value inherently, and hopefully you'll see it too.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on this is that art is a strange word because it is so subjective. And for me, games are an expressive medium. And art is, to me, I define art as being like the act of expression, the act of self-expression. So for me, my games are my art form, yes. So my answer to you personally, subjectively, is yes. But not everybody is making their games for artistic purposes. Yeah, so like what Amanda was saying, it's up to the creator, right?
Yeah,
and
I show work in galleries. Technically, you probably could consider me an artist. It seems, but like at the same time, like, so. It's a confusing label, really. But I do think that. We're getting there. We are seeing art grants going to game creators. We are seeing games in galleries more often. We are seeing more people accept games as an expressive medium, and that is a sign to me that it is at least possible, right? That games and art can be one and the same, and that we have opportunity to grow that as well. We see stuff like art house films. We accept that film is an artistic medium, but we also see stuff like comic book films where we know exactly what's going to happen, and it's all like, is that art necessarily? And I don't think it has to be necessarily, because art and entertainment are not one and the same.
But I do think that there's a lot of space in games and interactivity for art and artful expression and artists in general. So with that wonderful question, we are out of time. And that also means that Pixelpop Festival 2018, the 5th annual Pixelpop, has come to an end. Thank you all so much for being here. We cannot thank you enough for your support of the local and national indie games community. We cannot thank you enough for giving games a chance and for wanting to learn more about games and for being excited in general about our community. We do this for you, we do this for creators, and we are so happy that we have a community here that we can bring this event to. So thank you. And really quick, is there a place, if people want to get in contact with you after the panel to continue asking questions, is there a way that they can get in contact with you beyond just the Twitter handles on the screen?
You can email me at josh@intelligame.us, or you can hit us on social media at intelligameus.
I'm available on Twitter at Brave Mule, and my website is bravemule.com. And I'm going to be packing up the Where the Water Tastes Like Wine booth, so if you want to come and grab me, I can also give you a business card or anything like that.
I'll be breaking down my booth for like 20 minutes, but obviously my Twitter handle, probably the best way to get a hold of me, at Barely Concealed, and then I have a website for the project I'm currently working on, which is buttonsr.cool.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much, and thank you all again. Have a great night. We'll see you at the after party at 7 o'clock at Pieces Board Game Bar and Cafe, sponsored by Lewis Rice. Thank you all.
It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level.